All right, hello everyone. So today we're just going to talk a little bit about unit testing the network layer for Android, so specifically retrofit. Um, Now I've made sort of two tests here. I'll go more depth into them later, but essentially I want to talk about how I've made a bad request or a bad test, a relatively bad test, and then how I went about and making one that was slightly better. So we have the bad one, and then the better one. Specifically today, what it's going to be testing is just a successful response. Um, so, right, with that being said, the first thing we need to do is we need to define where testing, right? I'm just going to give you a quick down of what we're doing here, right? So we have this Twitch authentication. Now, if we look at what we're actually testing here, this Twitch authentication, which is our Twitch implementation. If you're unfamiliar, this app that I'm building and have released, it's a companion app for Twitch, which just adds a few more features for allowing mobile moderators, just a few more extra features than the native Twitch application does. But essentially, all of this has to do with Twitch's API and Twitch's backend and all that stuff, right? So as you can see here, what we're really dealing with is this Twitch authentication. And you might be saying to yourself, if you're unfamiliar with why I'm actually using this interface, really why I'm doing this is mainly, because you're supposed to program to an interface, not an implementation, right? And also because of polymorphism. What this is going to allow us to do is essentially anything that relies on this this Twitch implementation, right? We actually don't interact with it. We interact with it through this Twitch authentication interface, and it's just going to make testing a lot easier, and also it allows us to switch things out if we need to, right? If we want to implement a new entire class, we just make sure that the class uses this interface, and then none of the other classes or none of the other code breaks that uses it, which is really nice. Right. So if we get back to test code, right, that's really what we're doing. Then next we have the mock server. Now this mock server, as you can see, as the documentation states here, it's a scriptable web server, which is really great because essentially it allows us to mock our web server, which is needed because we don't actually want to make network requests, right? We don't want to test the network. We want to test how our code responds to the network, right? This again, this is another dependency injection here that I'm doing with another interface. But right, we're not testing this itself, right? We're testing how our code responds to it, right? Specifically, we're going to test this validate token, and what we're really testing here is just this is successful response, right? It's not really we're not really testing any sort of logic. What we're actually testing here is we're just testing and making sure that our code behaves as we expect it to, right? And actually, if we look into like the actual client here that I have implemented, right, this Twitch authentication client, which is used here, right, inside the actual implementation. So what's going to get injected into here? You can actually see that I've added a bunch of interceptors, right? So technically, this test that I'm doing now isn't really a real representation, but it's enough to sort of get us going and talking about how we can build better tests, right, from a certain perspective. But if you're unfamiliar with interceptors, right, you can just Google interceptors retrofit. But essentially, I have three here. This is a retry interceptor, so if any request is made and it's not either a 401 response or it fails, and then the failure isn't because the network or a 401 response, it then retries it three times. This is a network monitor interceptor. So essentially, what it does, checks first if there is if there's a network. If there is a network, it's going to send a request. If there isn't, excuse me, it's going to send a response back to the user and say there's no network. Now, this authenticator, the authentication 401, this is an interceptor that's going to check to see if the response is a 401 response, and it's going to return a special error that then is handled on the client side. Now, technically, this isn't what you should do with a 401 response. Technically, when you get a 401 response, you should take your token. That's right. 401 essentially means like right, you're not allowed to, the login that you attempted to do was you're not authorized, right? So essentially, what you should do is you should take your token, go refresh it, and then come back and then try the request again. However, Twitch doesn't offer refresh tokens if your app doesn't have a backend. Mine doesn't have a backend yet. So right now, I kind of have to do this way where I just have to tell my user, hey, your token's expired, please log in again. It's not the best user flow, but it's what we're working with right now. So, right. So to get back to the test, right? Sorry about that little side tangent there, talking about the interceptors. Again, I'll leave a link down in the description below. If you watch this, the test might be a little different here than what you see in the video because I've probably worked on this and iterated on it a bit more, but nonetheless, general principles that I'm trying to go over should stay true, right? So the first thing we do is you can see the documentation, you need to instantiate, then you need to start it. Then this at before and this at after, this runs before the test, this runs after the test, and then we just have to shut down the web server, right? So now let's talk about here, right? If you're unfamiliar with this run test, without getting too much detail, leave a link down in the description below where you can actually read the documentation on it. Essentially what it does, it's a special coroutine builder designed specifically for testing. So it allows us to run our code that uses coroutines. So that's great, right? So what's bad? What makes this one the bad version, right? First and foremost, it's just really hard to read, right? Like you can't understand without going through each individual code. You don't understand what's really going on, right? You got, you say, okay, JSON, okay, it looks like this is going to be a retrofit client. Okay, looks like it's creating, this Twitch authentication client. We're then assigning this under test, which, okay, I guess we're testing that. Then it's got this body, and then it's expected body, then it's got this JSON body. Okay, then on the web server, we're queuing a response. And then we finally have the actual testing or the actual request being made. Then finally we have the assertions, right? So first and foremost, right, tests should be very easy to read, right? Everywhere from the the name of the test, right, down to the variables, it should be relatively easy to read, right? So let's look how I can make a better version of this test, right? And both these tests actually pass, right, of giving a successful response, right? So this is the better version, right? The first thing I did was I actually pulled out, that sort of complex logic here, creating the retrofit client, and I put it in a builder class right here, specifically this builder. As you can see here, I'm using the actual builder method where we have the private instance of this retrofit builder here. We then have to, add the mocked URL, and then returning this, it just allows us to essentially call more methods on the object, right? We're creating essentially a singleton object here. We can then call build, and then it actually builds what our client here, which is what we want. And sort of all the, as you can see, this add conversion factor, the building and then creating, this stuff all sort of happens under the hood through when we actually do the test, right? We just say, okay, retrofit client, we add this, and then we build it, right? We don't have to understand any of it. Now, you might also see here that we're using, we have the type here. It's like the strong type instead of like the inferred type, right? Now, technically, we don't need to do this, right? We can just do it like that. Everything works fine. The reason I do this here, though, is because in case someone forgets to call build, right? It gets called right there. You can already see that it says, okay, it's expecting, and or it's required, and what was found. However, though, if we don't call the build and we actually delete this type here, as you can see, it doesn't get it until it's down here. So it just stops the error a little closer to when we're creating it, which is good, right? So essentially I've moved away that complexity. I then call this build. Then you see we're signing the under test, right? And then I've also just added a little bit of documentation here, right? A few code comments, which, is not bad, right? Code comments are good. It says, okay, the expected response, and body from calling, okay. Then we see we've scheduled a successful response, right? And that's what mock server allows us to do. It allows us to essentially in-queue responses, or essentially, which is going to return when we actually call the request, right? So when we actually call this validate token, a request is being made to the server, but our mock server is going to intercept that, and then it is going to return our in-queued response, right? Right, then lastly, then the same assertion, then the same assertion then. And then also, as you can see here, I just pulled out this, into a little helper function here. And then I just made it generic because it doesn't really matter, then you can use this over and over and over again, right? And then it returns as JSON dot body, right? So the main thing I really want to talk about here is mainly readability, right? That is the main thing that really makes this a bad test first, a better test. The logic in of itself, and this isn't really a logic heavy test, right? I just wanted to simply state that, you could make this test better by just doing a few simple things, right? It makes it easier for you to read and anyone else to read. In the next video coming up, I'll do some actual implementations, how to test a successful response with the interceptors, right? And a failure response and all the other different responses, 401 response, what's going to happen there, right? 500 response, slow network response, all that stuff. Right, so look forward to that. Thank you, and I'll see you in the next one.